It's a Mark 7 Praetorian. He's dead.
Send it!
Send it! Pray, cadets. Pray for yourselves.
They think war is a math equation, a neat little algorithm where perfect posture deflects the plasma and the highest pedigree takes the medal. They've never smelled a man empty his stomach in a trench. I'm just here to teach them that the math doesn't bleed. We do. The air in the Apex Orbital Academy didn't just smell clean, it smelled dead. It was a sharp, chemical absence of life, heavy with aerosolized disinfectants, and the faint, persistent ozone hum of the gravity generators beneath the floorboards. It always made Thomas nauseous. Thomas shifted his weight, wincing as a sharp ache flared in his left knee, a parting gift from a shrapnel burst in the Jupiter campaigns 8 years ago. His boots, issued surplus and worn smooth at the heels, squeaked against the pristine, shock-absorbent synthetic matting of the combat arena. The sound was loud, embarrassing. It cut through the hushed, reverent silence of the lecture hall like a belch in a cathedral. None of the cadets looked at him. They were too busy admiring themselves. There were 30 of them, arrayed in a perfect semicircle. The orbital elite, genetically curated before they were even embryos, born in the low-G luxury rings of Saturn and raised on diets of synthesized perfection. They were all 6'2", with symmetrical faces, flawless skin, and eyes the color of polished gemstones. They wore form-fitting tactical suits of matte gray, completely devoid of scuffs, wrinkles, or sweat stains. In the center of the ring stood Cadet Dawson. Dawson was currently dissecting the theoretical mechanics of close-quarters engagement, his voice a smooth, modulated baritone that echoed off the vaulted Durasteel ceiling. The primary failure of terrestrial engagements, Dawson was saying, gesturing gracefully with a perfectly manicured hand, is the reliance on gross motor function under panic. The Earthborn combat doctrine, if you can even call it a doctrine, prioritizes adrenaline over precision. It is, frankly, an archaic flailing, mud wrestling with kinetic weapons. A ripple of polite, condescending laughter moved through the cadets. Cadet Carter, a blond kid with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, smirked and tapped something into his datapad. Thomas scratched his jaw. The stubble there was coarse, irritating. He was thirsty. The academy only served filtered, mineral-balanced water that tasted like static electricity. He missed the metallic, irony tap water back in Chicago. He missed gravity that didn't feel like a mild suggestion. Efficiency is paramount, Dawson continued, dropping into a combat stance. It was a beautiful stance, flawless geometry. His weight was perfectly distributed, his center of gravity mathematically locked. Observe the Centaurian CQC form, minimal energy expenditure. We neutralize the threat's kinetic momentum and redirect it. We don't fight the enemy. We allow the enemy to defeat themselves. Dawson signaled the arena AI. A holographic training drone flickered into existence, a glowing blue silhouette armed with a simulated vibroblade. The drone lunged. Dawson didn't blink. He sidestepped, a movement so smooth it looked choreographed, tapped the drone's wrist to redirect the blade, and delivered a precise, open-palmed strike to the hologram's neck. The drone dissolved into blue static. The cadets clapped. Polite, measured applause. Thomas felt a headache blooming behind his eyes. It was a beautiful demonstration. It was also complete horseshit. Up in the observation gallery, separated from the arena by 6 inches of reinforced transparent aluminum, stood General Hayes. Hayes was an orbital, born and bred, but his face was lined, deeply weathered by actual sun and actual stress. He had the heavy, tired eyes of a man who had written too many letters to grieving mothers. Hayes leaned against the glass, his gaze fixed not on Dawson's flawless performance, but on Thomas. Thomas caught the general's eye. Hayes gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. "Don't do it, Tommy." But Dawson wasn't finished. Emboldened by the applause, the cadet turned his crystalline blue eyes toward the corner where Thomas stood, leaning against the wall. "Instructor Reed," Dawson said. The title sounded like a slur in his mouth. You've been remarkably quiet. As our resident, Earthborn liaison, perhaps you could offer a critique? Or does the Centaurian form simply exceed terrestrial comprehension? Thomas sighed. The breath hitched slightly in his chest. The air here was too thin, too scrubbed of humidity. He pushed himself off the wall. His joints popped. The sound was audible in the quiet room. "It's pretty," Thomas said. His voice was raspy, ruined by years of breathing cordite and ash, like a ballet. "I'm sure it works great when your enemy is made of light and programmed to run in a straight line." The silence in the room instantly curdled. The amusement vanished from the cadets' faces, replaced by a cold, unified indignation. "I beg your pardon?" Dawson said, his posture stiffening. Thomas walked slowly toward the center of the mat. He felt heavy, ugly, and entirely out of place in this room of porcelain dolls. His dark green fatigues were faded, bearing the faint, unwashable ghost stains of old blood and grease. "I said, it's a nice dance," Thomas repeated, stopping a few feet from Dawson. He could smell the cadet's cologne, something synthetic that smelled vaguely of pine needles. "But it assumes the guy trying to kill you gives a shit about geometry." "It relies on physics, instructor," Carter chimed in from the circle. "Physics is universal. Pain is universal," Thomas corrected, rubbing his bad knee. "Physics is just what happens while you're bleeding out." "That little sidestep you did, Dawson, you assumed the drone would commit its full weight to the lunge. What if it didn't? What if it feinted, took the strike to the neck, and shoved a jagged piece of metal into your femoral artery while you were posing?" Dawson's jaw tightened. An opponent taking a lethal strike to deliver a counter is statistically improbable. The human nervous system prevents it. "The times healthy times, human nervous system," Thomas said. "You ever fought a drifter high on synthetic stims? A trench runner who hasn't slept in 6 days and thinks you're a giant spider? They don't feel the neck strike, kid. They just bite your nose off." Dawson let out a short, dismissive breath. "Anecdotal barbarism. We are training for advanced warfare, not bar fights in the terrestrial slums." "War is just a bar fight with a bigger budget," Thomas muttered. He was tired of this. He turned to walk back to his corner. "Prove it," Dawson said. Thomas stopped. The synthetic floor squeaked beneath his boots. "Excuse me?" "If Earthborn tactics are so brutally effective," Dawson challenged, his voice rising, echoing up to the observation deck, "demonstrate it. Against a live proxy, no holograms. Unless, of course, the physical toll is too much for your vintage physiology." Thomas looked up at the glass. General Hayes was gripping the railing now. His knuckles were white. Thomas didn't feel heroic. He didn't feel a surge of righteous fury. He just felt deeply, profoundly exhausted. He tasted the sour residue of cheap coffee in the back of his throat. He looked at Dawson. The kid wasn't evil. He was just ignorant. He was a product of a society that thought violence could be sanitized, boxed up, and controlled. "All right," Thomas said softly. "Load the proxy." The atmosphere in the arena shifted instantly. The polite curiosity of the cadets vanished, replaced by a predatory hum. They weren't just watching a lecture anymore. They were watching a blood sport. They stepped back, expanding the circle, giving Thomas the center of the mat. Dawson moved to the control console at the edge of the arena. His fingers danced across the holographic interface. "Selecting standard combat proxy," Dawson announced. "Setting parameters to, let's say, advanced lethality. Pain receptors in the proxy bypassed. Kinetic force limiters disengaged." "Dawson, no," Carter whispered, suddenly looking nervous. "That's a Class 4 setup. That's for armored engagements." "Instructor Reed believes in the reality of pain," Dawson replied, not taking his eyes off the console. It would be disrespectful to shield him from it. Up in the observation gallery, the heavy security door hissed open. General Hayes didn't walk down to the floor, but he engaged the external comms. His voice boomed through the overhead speakers, startling the cadets. "Cadet Dawson." "Stand down," Hayes ordered. The general's voice wasn't angry. It was dead and flat. It was the voice of a man who knew exactly what a Class 4 proxy could do to a human body. "General, sir." Dawson replied smoothly, standing at attention. Instructor Reed has accepted a practical demonstration, according to Academy Charter 4, Section. I don't give a damn about the charter, son, Hayes interrupted. You are loading a Mark 7 Praetorian synthetic. That machine has a titanium weave chassis and hydraulic reflexes. It doesn't flinch. Exactly, sir. The perfect counter to adrenaline-based flailing. Dawson looked back at Thomas, a smug smile playing on his lips. Unless the instructor wishes to withdraw. Thomas was silent. He was busy unbuttoning the cuffs of his fatigue jacket. The fabric felt stiff. He rolled the sleeves up past his elbows, revealing forearms corded with wiry muscle and crisscrossed with thick, pale scars. Burn marks from plasma splash. Jagged lines from shrapnel. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a mechanic who had survived a very bad accident. He didn't look at Dawson. He looked at the floor, rolling his shoulders. The left one clicked loudly. Let him load it, General, Thomas said quietly. Tommy. Hayes's voice came through the speaker, dropping the formality. You're unarmored. That thing will break your spine. Thomas spat to the side. A small glob of saliva hit the pristine mat. A few cadets grimaced in disgust. Only if it catches me, Thomas said. Hayes stared down through the glass. He remembered a muddy, blood-soaked trench on Europa. He remembered a younger Thomas Reed, half blinded by his own blood, using a broken entrenching tool to cave in the armored visor of a raider. Hayes knew the orbital cadets thought war was a chess match. He knew Thomas Reed knew it was an abattoir. Hayes reached up and clicked off the microphone. He turned to the junior officer standing beside him in the booth, a fresh-faced lieutenant who was watching the scene with wide eyes. Sir? The lieutenant asked, confused by the general's silence. Should I override the arena controls? Hayes looked at the young cadets, standing in their perfect uniforms, completely unaware of the reality of the universe. Then he looked at Thomas, standing slouched, tired, and ready. No, Hayes whispered. The word barely left his throat. Pray. Sir, pray for Instructor Reed? No, Hayes said softly, stepping closer to the glass. Pray for the cadets, because he's about to show them what they're actually made of. Down on the floor, the arena lift hummed. The center of the mat parted, and the mark, 7 Praetorian, rose into the room. It was ugly. While the Academy drones were usually sleek holograms or polished white plasti-steel, the Praetorian was a brutalist nightmare of exposed hydraulics, carbon fiber plating, and matte black sensory arrays. It was vaguely humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, ending in blunt, heavy manipulators designed to crush bone. It stood 7 feet tall, smelling sharply of machine oil and ozone. The red optical band across its head flickered to life. It locked onto Thomas. Engagement parameters set. The arena AI announced in a cheerful, synthesized female voice. Lethal force authorized. Medical teams on standby. Combatants. Signal readiness. The Praetorian shifted into a wide, impossibly low stance. The hydraulic hiss of its joints sounded like a viper. The cadets held their breath. Dawson stood by the console, arms crossed, waiting for Thomas to take a stance, waiting for him to square his hips, raise his fists, and engage his core. Just like the textbook said, Thomas didn't take a stance. He stood flat-footed. He reached up and scratched the bridge of his nose. He took a slow, deep breath, smelling the oil and the synthetic pine of Dawson's cologne. His heart rate didn't spike. It slowed. A cold, dark, familiar blanket settled over his mind. The ache in his knee vanished, washed away by the sudden, singular focus of survival. He didn't look heroic. He looked hollowed out. Slowly, almost lazily, Thomas raised his right hand. He extended his index and middle finger, tapping the air twice. It wasn't a martial arts salute. It was the old trench signal. Send it. The Praetorian didn't lunge. It erupted. There was a deafening crack times, as its metallic feet shattered the top layer of the synthetic mat, propelling the 7-foot machine forward with the speed of a magnetic rail slug. It crossed the 20 feet between them in less than a second. Thomas didn't sidestep. He didn't try to redirect its momentum. He didn't dance. He dropped. He simply collapsed his own center of gravity, falling forward into the machine's path just as its massive right arm swung a blow that would have decapitated him. The blunt manipulator sheared through the air where Thomas's head had been a fraction of a second before, the wind of the strike rustling the hair on the back of his neck. Thomas didn't aim for the machine's chest or its armored joints. As he dropped, he drove the crown of his head directly into the Praetorian's midsection, burying his face in the tangle of exposed hydraulic lines and power cables. At the same time, his hands shot out, bypassing the heavy armor plating of its thighs, and grabbed the thin, vulnerable sensory wiring running behind its artificial knees. He pulled with everything he had, twisting his torso violently. The machine, carrying all its forward momentum and suddenly lacking stabilization in its knees, crashed forward. It was heavy 600 pounds of metal and synthetic muscle. It came down on top of Thomas. A sickening crunch echoed through the hall. A collective gasp ripped through the cadets. Carter took a step back, his face draining of color. Dawson's smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer bewilderment. That wasn't in the manual. You don't dive times under times a kinetic strike. On the mat, it was a mess. Thomas felt a rib snap. The pain was immediate, a sharp, white-hot spike that drove the breath from his lungs. The metallic bulk of the Praetorian crushed his chest. He tasted copper. His lip was split, blood pooling on his tongue. He swallowed it automatically, so he wouldn't choke. The machine wasn't dead. It didn't feel pain. It immediately began to reorient, its left arm pinning Thomas's shoulder to the ground, its optical band burning bright red as it raised its right arm to deliver a fatal downward strike to his skull. Thomas couldn't breathe. His vision swam with gray spots. But this was the dirt. This was where the Earthborn lived. He didn't try to push the machine off. That was physics, and physics said he would lose. Instead, he wrapped his legs around the machine's waist, locking his ankles together to anchor himself to it. His right arm was pinned, but his left arm was free. He didn't punch the armor. He shoved his left hand blindly up into the machine's inner chassis, right beneath the glowing optical band. He felt hot metal burning his knuckles. He felt sharp edges slicing the skin of his forearm. He ignored it. His fingers found the thick, pulsing bundle of the main optical relay. The Praetorian's right arm came down. Thomas jerked his head to the side. The heavy metal fist slammed into the mat right next to his ear, shattering the flooring and sending a shockwave through his skull. The ringing in his ears was deafening, but his left hand clenched. He gripped the optical relay, wrapped the thick wires around his wrist for leverage, and yanked. He didn't pull with his arm. He used his entire body, driving his hips upward, arching his broken ribs against the machine's weight, screaming through blood-stained teeth. With a wet, tearing screech, the wires snapped. Sparks showered over Thomas's face, burning small pinpricks into his cheeks. The Praetorian's red optical band flickered, flashed violently, and died. The machine was blind, but it wasn't deactivated. It thrashed wildly, its heavy limbs striking the mat, striking its own chassis, trying to locate the organic mass beneath it. One of its flailing arms clipped Thomas in the jaw. His head snapped back. He tasted more blood. His vision blurred heavily, the pristine white ceiling of the arena spinning sickeningly above him. "Move," his brain screamed. "Move or die." Thomas unhooked his legs. He didn't try to stand up. He rolled. He scrambled across the mat on his hands and knees like an animal, slipping in his own blood. He left a smeared red trail on the perfect, gray synthetic floor. He heard the Praetorian hiss behind him, its audio sensors trying to track his movement. It was lumbering to its feet, swiping blindly at the air. Thomas got to his feet. He staggered. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, bleeding profusely from the deep cuts on his forearm. He was hunched over, clutching his ribs with his right hand. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving, his face a mess of soot, sweat, and crimson. He looked at the cadets. They were frozen. They looked sick. Carter had a hand over his mouth, his eyes wide with horror. Dawson was staring at the blood on the mat, his perfect posture completely forgotten. This wasn't the clean, mathematical redirection of force they had been taught. This was brutal. It was desperate. It was ugly. Thomas spat a mouthful of blood onto the mat. It landed with a wet smack. "See?" Thomas gasped, his voice a wet rasp. He pointed a trembling, blood-slicked finger at the blind, thrashing machine. "It doesn't care about your center of gravity." The Praetorian heard his voice. It turned toward him, servos whining, and charged blindly. Thomas didn't run. He waited. He timed his breathing, trying to keep the fractured rib from puncturing his lung. 3 steps. 2 steps. As the machine reached him, swiping its arms in a wide, lethal arc, Thomas ducked under the swing. It wasn't graceful. He stumbled, almost falling, but he got inside the machine's guard. He drove his right boot squarely into the side of the machine's compromised right knee, the same joint he had ripped the stabilization wires from earlier. The joint buckled backward with a loud snap. The Praetorian pitched sideways, completely losing its balance. As it fell, Thomas grabbed the heavy hydraulic piston on the back of its neck, planted his foot on its spine, and shoved with all his remaining strength. The machine crashed face first into the reinforced wall of the arena. The impact was horrific. The heavy carbon fiber plating of its head crumpled. A shower of blue sparks erupted from its chassis, followed by a thick plume of black, acrid smoke. The machine twitched once, its limbs spasming against the mat, and then went completely still. The arena AI chimed, its cheerful voice jarring against the heavy silence of the room. "Combat complete. Threat neutralized. Winner, Instructor Reed." Thomas stood there for a moment, swaying. The adrenaline was leaving his system, replaced by a crushing, nauseating wave of pain. The smell in the room had changed. The sterile disinfectant was gone. The air was thick with the stench of burnt rubber, electrical fire, sweat, and the sharp, undeniable copper tang of human blood. He looked down at his ruined uniform, at his bleeding arm. Then he looked at Dawson. Dawson was pale, his lips parted slightly. He wasn't looking at the destroyed multi-million credit machine. He was looking at Thomas. He was looking at a man who was broken, bleeding, completely lacking in grace or form, but who was undeniably, irrevocably alive. Thomas wiped the blood from his chin with the back of his hand, smearing it across his cheek. He took a painful, hitching breath. "Math doesn't bleed, kid," Thomas whispered. The room was so quiet that everyone heard it. "You want to survive out there? You gotta be willing to bleed first." Thomas turned away from the cadets. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't wait for the medical team. He just started walking slowly, painfully, toward the exit locker room, leaving a trail of red footprints on the flawless white mat behind him. The med bay was too bright. It was a harsh, unrelenting white light that stabbed directly through Thomas's retinas and settled into a dull, throbbing migraine at the base of his skull. He sat hunched on the edge of a stainless steel biobed. The metal was freezing against his bare back, leaching the last bits of warmth from his skin. The adrenaline crash had hit him 10 minutes ago, bringing with it a violent, uncontrollable shivering. His teeth chattered against the rim of a plastic cup as he tried to swallow a lukewarm dose of liquid painkillers. It tasted like battery acid and crushed chalk. Beside him, an automated suture arm buzzed like an angry hornet, its microscopic needles weaving synthetic biothread through the jagged tear in his left forearm. Every time it pulled the thread tight, a hot spike of agony shot up to his elbow. He didn't wince. He just stared at the floor. The heavy scent of iodine and sterile gauze hung in the air, barely masking the lingering, metallic smell of his own dried blood. The automatic doors hissed open. General Hayes walked in. Hayes didn't look at the whirring medical droid or the bloody tactical jacket discarded on a nearby chair. It was a canvas of deep purple and mottled yellow bruising, wrapped tightly in a rigid compression bandage. 3 fractured ribs, Hayes said, his voice flat, reading from a translucent datapad. A minor concussion, lacerated radial artery, a hairline fracture in your right orbital bone. Hayes lowered the pad. "The chief medical officer tells me you refused the spinal block for the suturing. Makes my legs go numb," Thomas rasped. His throat felt like it was coated in sand. I don't like not feeling my legs. Hayes sighed, a heavy, tired sound that seemed to deflate his chest. He pulled up a rolling stool and sat down opposite Thomas, resting his forearms on his knees. The pristine fabric of his orbital uniform looked absurdly out of place next to the blood-streaked biobed. You nearly died today, Tommy. Over a point of pride. It wasn't pride, Thomas said quietly. He took another sip of the terrible liquid, grimacing as it burned down his throat. Pride is what they have. Pride is standing in a perfect stance while a 600-pound piece of metal caves your chest in. I just showed them the alternative. You showed them butchery. I showed them the dirt. Thomas finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and deeply shadowed. You read the casualty reports from the Perseus Rim, General. I know you do. The Centaurian CQC forms, the mathematical redirection of kinetic force. It's getting them slaughtered out there. The Raiders don't fight with math. They fight with scrap metal and stims. Your cadets are graduating with perfect test scores and dying in their first deployment because nobody ever told them what it feels like to be punched in the mouth. Hayes looked away, his jaw working. He stared at the blank, white wall of the medbay. They're kids, Thomas. They've lived their whole lives in climate-controlled gravity rings. They don't know how to process what you did out there. They better learn. Because the universe doesn't care about their climate control. A shadow fell across the frosted glass of the medbay doors. The doors slid apart, with a soft whisper of pneumatic seals. Cadet Dawson stood in the threshold. He was still wearing his gray tactical suit, but the crisp, immaculate aura was gone. His collar was unfastened. His posture, usually a masterclass in rigid military bearing, was slumped. He looked pale, almost sick, and his eyes darted nervously between the general and the bruised, battered instructor on the bed. General Hayes, sir. Instructor Reed. Dawson swallowed hard. His voice lacked its usual resonant confidence. It was thin, almost reedy. I apologize for the intrusion. I can wait outside. Hayes stood up, smoothing the front of his jacket. He looked at Dawson, then down at Thomas. No, I was just leaving. Hayes stepped past the cadet, pausing in the doorway. Get some rest, Tommy. That's an order. The doors closed, leaving Thomas and Dawson alone in the sterile quiet, save for the incessant buzzing of the suture arm. Thomas didn't say anything. He just watched the kid. He waited to see if the arrogance would return, if Dawson would try to rationalize the fight, to explain how Thomas had technically violated the rules of engagement. Dawson stepped further into the room. He looked at the bloody jacket on the chair, then at the deep, purple bruising wrapping around Thomas's ribcage. Does it? Dawson started, then stopped, his throat bobbing. How bad is the pain? Bad enough, Thomas said flatly. I reviewed the arena telemetry, Dawson said, taking a step closer. His polished boots scuffed awkwardly against the floor. When you drove your hand up into the chassis, the thermal runoff from the optical relay was registering at over 200 degrees. You grabbed it barehanded. Yeah, why didn't you let go? Thomas let out a short, painful bark of laughter that immediately turned into a coughing fit. He clutched his ribs, squeezing his eyes shut until the spasm passed. He tasted copper again. Because if I let go, it would have crushed my skull, Thomas breathed, wiping his mouth with the back of his uninjured hand. That's the part your textbooks leave out, Dawson. The choice. When it comes down to it, you don't choose between a perfect block and a perfect strike. You choose between burning your hand to the bone or dying. That's the only math that matters. Dawson stared at him, his crystalline blue eyes wide and searching. The condescension was completely gone, replaced by a raw, terrifying realization. The neat little boxes he had organized his worldview into had just been violently crushed. I don't know how to do that, Dawson whispered. It was an admission of defeat, stripped of all ego. I don't know how to fight when the geometry fails. The suture arm finished its work, snipping the thread and retracting into the wall with a soft click. Thomas swung his legs off the bed. His knee flared with a dull ache, and his ribs screamed, but he planted his bare feet on the cold floor and stood up. He was shorter than Dawson by 3 inches, but right now, he seemed to fill the room. Good, Thomas said. pulling a clean gray undershirt over his bruised torso, wincing as the fabric dragged across his stitches. "That means you're finally ready to learn." At 0600 hours the next morning, the 30 cadets of the orbital elite stood in formation. They were not in the pristine, climate-controlled arena. The arena was currently sealed, a hazmat team scrubbing the dried blood and synthetic fluids from the mat. Instead, they stood in sub-basement level 4, an old, decommissioned cargo bay near the station's outer hull. The air here was awful. The environmental scrubbers barely reached this deep. It was heavy, humid, and smelled intensely of old grease, ozone, and the sour tang of stagnant condensation pooling in the floor grates. The lighting was poor, provided by flickering, caged sodium bulbs that cast long, distorted shadows across the scarred Durasteel bulkheads. The cadets looked deeply uncomfortable. They shifted their weight, their boots splashing softly in the thin layer of grime on the floor. Thomas walked down the line. He wore standard black fatigues. He moved slowly, a pronounced limp in his left leg, his torso stiff from the compression bandages hidden beneath his shirt. He carried a heavy, canvas duffel bag over his uninjured shoulder. He dropped the bag in the center of the room. It hit the metal deck with a heavy, wet thud. "Open it," Thomas ordered, nodding toward Carter. Carter stepped forward gingerly, unzipping the heavy canvas. He peered inside and frowned. "Instructor? It's just dirt. Wet dirt." "It's mud," Thomas corrected. 60 pounds of it, imported from the hydroponics bay. "Reach in." Carter hesitated, looking at his immaculate gray tactical gloves. "Take the gloves off, Carter. Reach in." Slowly, Carter peeled off his gloves, knelt, and plunged his hands into the dark, wet soil. He grimaced at the texture, cold, gritty, and profoundly unclean. "Now, rub it on your face," Thomas said. A ripple of shock went through the formation. Carter froze, looking up at Thomas to see if it was a joke. Thomas's face was a mask of stone. His right eye was completely swollen shut, ringed in violent shades of black and purple. "Instructor, do it." Carter squeezed his eyes shut and smeared the wet, gritty mud across his cheeks and forehead. It dripped down his chin, staining the collar of his pristine uniform. He stood up, looking humiliated and thoroughly disgusted. "Take a deep breath, Carter," Thomas said, pacing slowly in front of the formation. "Smell it. Feel the grit in your teeth. That is what a trench on Proxima 3 smells like. It smells like rot. It smells like desperation. And it is exactly where you will be fighting." Thomas stopped pacing and faced the cadets. "You've been taught that combat is a science," he said, his raspy voice echoing off the cold metal walls. "You've been taught to seek the clean victory, the flawless execution. I am here to tell you that the clean victory is a myth sold to politicians and grieving parents." He pointed to a large, rusted cargo container sitting in the corner of the room. "Behind that container is a maze of maintenance tunnels. The lights are off. The gravity is set to 0.8, which means you will feel heavy, sluggish, and uncoordinated. In a moment, you are going to go into those tunnels. In pairs." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of heavy, blunt training batons made of dense, synthetic rubber. He tossed them onto the floor. They bounced dully. No holograms today. No safety limiters. No math. He looked directly at Dawson. The cadet met his gaze, his jaw set. Dawson didn't look arrogant anymore. He looked terrified. And he was trying desperately to hide it. "When you go in there," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous gravel, "you are going to follow the Earthborn doctrine. Is greater than the Earthborn rules of engagement. Is greater than. Rule 1. You are already dead. Accept it. The moment the drop pod opens, your life is forfeit. If you fight to protect your life, you will flinch. You will hesitate. If you accept that you are dead, you fight only to make the enemy join you. Is greater than. Rule 2. Bite the dog. If they take your weapon, use your hands. If they break your hands, use your teeth. There is no biological limitation on violence when you stop caring about surviving the next 5 minutes. Is greater than. Rule 3. It is supposed to hurt. Pain is not an indicator of failure. Pain is simply data. It tells you that you are still conscious. Use it. Your objective is simple, Thomas said, gesturing to the dark maw of the maintenance tunnel. Get from one end to the other. I have programmed the station's automated defense drones to hunt you. They are armed with kinetic stun rounds. If they hit you, it will feel like a sledgehammer breaking your femur. If you try to stand in a perfect stance and parry, they will shoot you in the face. He picked up a baton and walked over to Dawson, pressing it into the cadet's chest. Dawson gripped it tightly. You don't glide through this, Dawson. You crawl. You hide in the filth. You drag your partner by the collar of their shirt when they get hit. You survive. Dawson looked down at the baton, feeling the heavy, unbalanced weight of it in his hands. It wasn't a precision instrument. It was a club. He looked at Carter, whose face was smeared with dark, wet mud, shivering slightly in the cold, damp air of the sub-basement. Yes, instructor, Dawson said softly. Louder, Thomas barked, the sudden volume making several cadets flinch. Yes, instructor, Dawson yelled, his voice cracking slightly. Thomas stepped back. The ache in his ribs was a constant, blinding fire, but he pushed it down into the dark, familiar place in his mind. He looked at the 30 cadets. They were no longer porcelain dolls. The sterile illusion of the academy had been shattered, replaced by the terrifying, chaotic reality of the dark. They were scared, and that was exactly where they needed to be. Welcome to the dirt, Thomas whispered. Enter the tunnels. If you felt the grit, the pain, and the raw humanity of this Earthborn lesson, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who appreciates gritty, boots-on-the-ground sci-fi, where survival isn't pretty, it's earned. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our weekly deep dives into the best HFY dramas across the galaxy. Drop a comment below. What's your first rule of survival? See you in the trenches.